The Mediterranean Sea was very important to the Roman civilization. In fact, the Romans would eventually call the Mediterranean Sea our sea, or in Latin, Mare Nostrum. So how did Rome go from being a fairly unimpressive group of Latin settlements on some hills south of the Tiber River to encircling the entire Mediterranean Sea and amassing one of the largest empires in the history of the world? Well, that's what we're going to look at in this lesson. Now, before we get into it, please understand that this was an unintended empire that the Romans built. In other words, there wasn't a time when a group of Romans were sitting around and said, "Hey, let's take over the entire Mediterranean world." That wasn't anything that was ever a part of some grand plan. Instead, as Rome just naturally expanded and got larger, they bumped into people that they eventually got into a conflict with, that they eventually defeated and took over their land. And that's how the Romans built such a big empire. So, we're going to look first of all at how the Romans conquered the peninsula of Italy, then how they took possession of the western half of the Mediterranean Sea, and then how they took over the eastern half of the Mediterranean Sea. So let's begin by looking at how Rome became the master of the Italian peninsula. Now, remember again that Rome was this relatively small city just south of the Tiber River, populated primarily by Latins. However, those were not the only Latins on the Italian peninsula. Instead, there were other Latins around Rome, which eventually revolted against the Romans. The Romans had extended their control over these other Latins. These Latins revolted. The Romans then crushed the revolt and conquered all of them, and thus began to expand their territory in that manner. Then, the Romans moved north across the Tiber River and conquered the Etruscans, who were in the northern part of the peninsula. The southern part of the peninsula was a very interesting story because that was where a lot of Greeks lived. Matter of fact, so many Greeks lived there that it was called by the Romans Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. Now, as the Romans moved south to conquer Magna Graecia, the Greeks there recognized that they needed some help. And so they were able to get in contact with their distant relatives over in Greece proper, and were able to bring over a man by the name of Pyrrhus. Now, Pyrrhus was believed to be a great military commander because he was related to Alexander the Great. So therefore, there must be something in the blood or in the DNA of this guy to make him really good. Well, he was pretty effective. One of the things that made Pyrrhus effective was that he was one of the first in ancient warfare to use elephants in battle. Now, that might seem kind of odd today to think of using elephants in battle, but the elephants of the ancient world were like the tanks of modern warfare. And it was very difficult to stop elephants when they wanted to move on top of you. Well, Pyrrhus was able to lead his Greek army in actually defeating the Romans on two separate occasions. However, in those two victories, Pyrrhus suffered significant numbers of losses, significant damage. So much so that, in essence, he had to end up retreating and had to end up going home anyway. And so that has led to a term that we now use in our own time called a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory whose costs outweigh any advantage that may have been gained otherwise. So whenever there's a victory, whether it be in military situations or sports situations or any other context, where you have to spend or lose so much to win, it really isn't worth winning. That's a Pyrrhic victory. It's an empty, hollow victory. So the Romans were able to take possession of the southern part of Italy, and thereby they unified the boot under their command. Well, as Rome expanded and as they conquered these other civilizations, they took a page out of the Persian plan for success. And they were very kind and very fair to those that they conquered. They actually allowed people that they conquered to become citizens in the Roman Republic, which allowed them the opportunity to vote and to hold political office. Really the only thing that the Romans demanded at this time was that these subject people provide troops to fill the Roman army. So that's how Rome took possession of the peninsula of Italy. Now let's look at how Rome took possession of the Western Mediterranean Sea, how they became the masters of that. And here we find the interesting story of the Punic Wars. Now, the Punic Wars were fought between Rome and Carthage. So let's take a moment to talk about Carthage. Carthage was located in North Africa. And in North Africa, they had a lot of good harbors that were there. So they were very good at trading on the seas. They also had a lot of mineral resources that they were able to take advantage of. Now, you may recall that Carthage was a colony of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were from the eastern Mediterranean world, but traded extensively throughout the Mediterranean Sea and planted colonies all over the place, one of which was Carthage. So the Carthaginians were descendants of the Phoenicians. And as a result, the Carthaginians had a fantastic navy. I mean, the navy is very important to them to defend their ships that were involved in trade. Matter of fact, the Carthaginians had the best navy in the world at that time. And as a result, they were beginning to build an empire of their own in the Western Mediterranean world. They possessed northern Africa, parts of northern Africa, parts of southern Spain, and the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, as well as part of the island of Sicily. So as the Carthaginians expanded, they bumped into the Romans, who were expanding their territory in this part of the world as well. And they soon became commercial rivals. They were competing over trade routes and ports and over raw materials and markets and things like that. And so this rivalry began to develop and ultimately would bring about armed conflict. Now, why do we call these the Punic Wars? Well, we call them the Punic Wars because that's what the Romans called them. Because the Latin word punici is the Latin word for Phoenicians. All right? And so again, Phoenician simply means purple people. So this is the War of the Purple People. There were 3 Punic Wars, and we're going to look at them in order. First of all, the First Punic War, which lasted from 264 to 241 BC. Now, the cause of this First Punic War was focused on the island of Sicily, right here, the island of Sicily. This was the focal point because Carthage had a presence on Sicily and the Romans had a presence on Sicily. So who would control Sicily? That was the issue in this First Punic War. Well, as the war began, Rome had a very small problem. They had no navy whatsoever. All that Rome had done up until this point was fight on land with their army. They had no navy. However, they were able to take advantage of a Carthaginian ship that they had captured or had washed up on their beaches one day to figure out how to build a boat. They didn't even know how to build a proper naval vessel. Well, hey, fantastic. They now know how to build naval vessels, but they don't know how to use them effectively in battle. Now, back then, the way that naval battles were fought was that one boat would try to ram itself into the other boat and then hopefully be able to extricate itself properly, because that other boat that was rammed, of course, is going to sink. And that is what the Persian Navy did, the Greek Navy did, and what the Carthaginian Navy did. All the navies of the ancient world, they tried to ram themselves into other boats. Well, the Romans were not skilled enough at sailing in order to accomplish that. So what the Romans decided to do was to try to maximize their supremacy using foot soldiers. However, it's very difficult for foot soldiers to fight on top of the water, as you probably could figure out. So what the Romans did is the Romans outfitted their ships with a special contraption called a corvus, which is Latin for a crow or a raven. Very simply, what this was is it was a plank or a footbridge that would stand up in the air, stand erect in the air, but at the very top was a spike, a metal spike. And what the Romans would do is rather than attack the enemy boat in a perpendicular fashion to try to ram it, they would come up parallel to the boat, and then they would drop the corvus down so that that spike would latch into the deck of the enemy ship. And now the two ships are connected to each other, and now there is a footbridge that will enable the Roman soldiers, the Roman army soldiers on the boat, to travel by foot across the bridge and into the enemy boat. And then they would subdue the crew of the enemy boat. And not only do you defeat the boat, you get to capture the boat. So you get to expand the size of your navy in the process. And this turned out to be a brilliant strategy that the Romans used very, very effectively. And in the end, the Romans won the First Punic War. Now, one thing of interest in the First Punic War is that the main battle of the First Punic War was the Battle of Incomus. And this was a naval battle, and it was such a large naval battle. There were so many ships involved in the battle that it was the largest naval battle in history until World War II. So for over 2,000 years, this was a very significant naval battle. All right, well, what were the consequences of this First Punic War? Well, Rome took possession of all of Sicily, and Carthage had to pay for Rome's war expenses. Well, the Carthaginians were not content to let this be the end of things, and so a few years later, there would be the Second Punic War, which lasted from 218 to 201 BC. Now, the causes of the Second Punic War were, first of all, that Carthage had captured a Roman ally in southern Spain. Rome had made an alliance with a city in southern Spain, the city of Saguntum, that the Carthaginians then came and captured it, because again, Carthage had a presence in Spain. So what Rome did is Rome decided to divide and conquer. So half of the Roman army would go and attack Spain, while the other half would go and attack Carthage directly. Now, one thing very different about the Second Punic War from the First Punic War is that by this time, Rome's navy was far superior to the Carthaginian navy. Well, the Carthaginians had a secret weapon, and his name was Hannibal. Hannibal was put in charge of the Carthaginian forces, and he was tasked with trying to defeat the Romans in the Second Punic War. Hannibal has gone down in history as one of the greatest military minds and leaders in all of warfare. His tactics are still studied in the modern world in war colleges. Now, what Hannibal decided to do was he decided to go straight at the heart of Rome. He wanted to get to the city of Rome itself and capture it, because he believed if he could do that, then the Romans would surrender. So he wanted to invade Italy and capture it. However, he wanted to try to catch the Romans by surprise. Now, along the way, Hannibal was banking on the fact that these peoples that the Romans had conquered had grown tired of being ruled by the Romans and would want to rebel against them, and that they would then join his forces, and he could then take advantage of that to win. So Hannibal marched across what is now southern France into the Alps. And it's right here that things got very interesting for Hannibal, because the Alps, of course, are very tall and rugged mountains. And not only that, but Hannibal was attempting to cross the Alps in the wintertime. So while he was able to get through the Alps, it was very costly for Hannibal and would prove to be very harmful for him in the long run. He lost a lot of men, he lost a lot of supplies, and he lost a lot of elephants. So just imagine in your mind an elephant slipping on some snow or ice and falling off a cliff in the Alps. That had to be an amazing thing to see and to hear. Anyway, he was able to get through the Alps and get into Italy proper, and the Romans were scared to death. They were incredibly surprised by his success. They never in a million years did the Romans believe that someone would actually invade them and attack them through the Alps. So the Romans were on the run from the very first moment that Hannibal set foot in Italy. Well, Hannibal, moved all through the peninsula and attacked here and there and had success and looped around, and the Romans were very scared of him, and eventually came to this part of southeastern Italy where there would be the famous Battle of Cannae. And this was Hannibal's finest hour. It occurred in the year 216 BC. Now, Hannibal was outnumbered. We believe that he was outnumbered somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 1. There were twice as many Romans as there were Carthaginians at this battle. And Hannibal realized that, and so he decided to employ his military genius in order to try to win. So I'm going to set this map aside, and I'm going to pull up a drawing here of the Battle of Cannae. Now, at the top of the diagram here, you see the Roman forces and how they were organized in their rows and in their columns. Now, what Hannibal did is he orchestrated his forces and initially had them in a bulging shape here. Okay, you see how the Carthaginian line, called the Spanish and the Gallic infantry, so from Spain and from Gaul, where these guys came from, they bulged forward, all right? And Hannibal's thinking there is that with this line bulging forward, the Romans would recognize that this was a weak point in the Carthaginian line. And so and that's exactly what happened. The Romans concentrated their attack on the center of the Carthaginian line, hoping to break through there, and then they could divide and conquer. But what Hannibal had told his men was that as the Romans attack, you should retreat. And so the Roman, or the Carthaginian line, went from bulging outward to bulging inward, forming this shape here. And so the Romans began to be funneled into this center, and the Carthaginian line began to swing in from the sides, especially the Carthaginian cavalry. And so what eventually happened is that this entire Roman army was sucked into this and was completely surrounded by the Carthaginian infantry and cavalry. And this proved to be a tremendous tactic for Hannibal, because he was able to mitigate the fact that he had far fewer forces, because, of course, the vast majority of the Roman forces were in the middle of this mass. And if they wanted to fight anybody, they were going to have to fight other Romans, because the Carthaginians were on the edges. And so this enabled the Carthaginians to score a decisive victory. Perhaps as many as 60,000 Romans went down that day, where only 6,000 Carthaginians did. And this just further petrified and terrified the Romans, and they were afraid that at any moment Hannibal was going to attack Rome itself and defeat it. Not to mention the fact that Rome was also distracted this time by the situation in Macedonia, or in northern Greece, which had become a new ally of Carthage, and by rebellion on the island of Sicily from the colony of Syracuse. So Rome was in a real mess here in the early stages of the Second Punic War. However, Hannibal could never capture Rome itself. He could never capture Rome itself, which was his ultimate goal. Now, there were two reasons why he couldn't do that. One was that Hannibal never possessed the siege equipment necessary in order to conquer Rome. He couldn't just attack Rome head on. He'd have to surround it, lay siege to it, starve the city out. Contributing to that was the fact that once again Hannibal had lost so many men and supplies and elephants in his crossing of the Alps, and there were no reinforcements on the way. A second thing that contributed to Hannibal's inability to take the city of Rome was that the Roman subjects did not rise up and overthrow Roman rule and join the Carthaginian ranks like he had hoped. And that is where the Roman strategy of being kind to their subjects paid off big time. Well, the war dragged on, and Hannibal's wreaking havoc in the Italian countryside, but he isn't able to bring the war to a successful conclusion for him and for the Carthaginians. Well, in the year 202, we have the climactic conclusion of the Second Punic War with the Battle of Zama. And this is where the Romans have a new commander by the name of Scipio. And what Scipio decided to do is he said, you know what, I'm tired of playing defense. I want to play offense. And we're going to take this fight directly to Carthage. And so Roman forces sailed from Italy across the Mediterranean to attack Carthage directly. Well, this also served the purpose of causing Hannibal's army to have to get on boats and sail across the Mediterranean to Carthage, because there was no one to defend the homeland. And so that's what had to happen. So now the stage is set for this battle to take place. Now, how did this battle transpire? Well, let's set the map aside again, and let's look at this diagram of the Battle of Zama. Now, here I need to point out that in this portion you have the Roman forces, and in this portion you have the Carthaginian forces. Now, I would draw your attention to these skirmishers that the Romans had and how they were spaced, how there were gaps between them. Because what what Scipio told his men to do was that as you approached the Carthaginian elephants, and the Carthaginians almost always led with their elephants, as you approach those elephants, I want you to scare them. I want you to spook them. And that's what the Romans did, is they yelled and screamed and did things that scared the elephants. Well, the elephants did one of two things. Some elephants got spooked and charged forward. Well, they charged forward through the alleyways in the Roman forces that Scipio had organized. Or the Carthaginian elephants got scared and turned around and ran back this way. And they trampled their own men in the process. And so this tactic of Scipio was very effective and enabled the Romans to win the Battle of Zama and ultimately win the Second Punic War. Well, what were the consequences of the Second Punic War? Well, Rome had to give up, or Carthage, had to give up all of its land outside of North Africa. So they had to give up their land in Spain, all of the islands that they possessed. Carthage was allowed to have only 10 boats in its navy. Carthage had to pay a large sum of money to Rome. And as a result, Rome was the master of the Western Mediterranean Sea. But you may recall I said there were 3 Punic Wars. So why was there a third Punic War if Rome was the master? Well, let's talk about that. The Third Punic War was from the years 149 to 146 BC, over 50 years after the Second Punic War ended. So we're talking about the grandchildren of the generation that fought the Second Punic War. What were the causes of this Third Punic War? Well, Rome, once again, was afraid of Carthage's growing strength. I will say, though, that this was a bit of a paranoid fear, an irrational fear that the Romans had, because Carthage really wasn't getting that strong. There was still, though, this long-standing anger of Carthage in Rome. Well, Carthage broke one of the treaty provisions from the Second Punic War. And Rome said, all right, since you broke this provision, you're going to have to pack up the entire city and move 10 miles inland. Well, that would prove destructive to the Carthaginians because living on the water was incredibly vital to their civilization. And so they refused to do that. And so Rome said, okay, well, we're going to declare war, which they did. So there was a 3-year war in which the Romans invaded and surrounded Carthage. They laid siege to the city for 3 years, and eventually house-to-house fighting took place. It was a very, very gruesome and bloody war, and eventually the Carthaginians surrendered. So consequences of the Third Punic War were that Rome basically destroyed Carthage. They plowed up the land, they took all of the inhabitants and sold them into slavery, and made northern Africa a Roman province by simply the name of Africa. And so Carthage never again would be any sort of threat to anything Rome wanted to do in the western part of the Mediterranean world. So how did Rome become the master of the eastern Mediterranean world? Well, the eastern Mediterranean world, remember, was where Alexander had been dominant. And so the portions of his empire were still there. So that's basically what the Romans would attack. Now, remember that Macedonia, that northern part of Greece, had come to help Carthage during the Second Punic War. Well, Rome eventually defeated Macedonia, and that greatly weakened them. Now, Syria, farther to the east, moved to the west to take advantage of Macedonia's weakness, but they ran into Rome there as well, and so Rome was able to conquer Syria and take even more land in the eastern part of the Mediterranean world. So Rome defeated both Macedonia and Syria. Rome then began to move south toward Egypt. But before Rome could attack Egypt, the Egyptians said, hey, could we go ahead and surrender? And so they did. And they made an alliance with the Romans. And so Rome took over Egypt. And that is very simply how Rome was able to take over the eastern Mediterranean world. Now, a lot of that I just described was also happening at the same time as the 3 Punic Wars. So please don't think that all of this is exactly sequential and chronological, but we're looking at the 2 different regions separately. Now, here again, Rome has gone from this little city to owning all of the land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And it happened relatively quickly. And again, there was no grand plan for doing this. So how did Rome control and govern and administer this huge area? Well, they reorganized all of this land into provinces, again, taking a page out of the Persian playbook. they divided into smaller pieces called provinces, and each province was ruled by a governor that was able to exert local control, but the governors were still ultimately responsible to the leadership back in Rome. Now, the people in the provinces were granted freedom. They were granted a tremendous measure of self-rule as long as they did not rebel. The Romans looked very harshly at rebellion and say, well, they'll be nice to you up front, but if you rebel, then the Romans would be very, very harsh in return. The provinces had to pay tribute to Rome, whether that be in the form of money or perhaps even in the form of grain. And in return, Rome provided order, government, and protection against others that would do them harm. And that is how Rome was able to effectively administer such a large and vast area that they took possession of. So, that's how Rome went from being the small little city to being the owners of the entire Mediterranean world. So we looked at how Rome took possession of Italy, how Rome became masters of the western Mediterranean Sea by defeating the Carthaginians, and how they became masters of the eastern Mediterranean Sea by defeating what remained of Alexander the Great's old empire.